are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Everybody, welcome to Locked On Lakers for Tuesday. Brian Kamenetzky and Andy Kamenetzky. I want to let you know today's episode brought to you by Michelob Ultra at only 2.6 carbs and 95 calories. It's only worth it if you enjoy it. Stay tuned for the Ultra Player of the Week coming up later in the episode. Andy, a bunch of stuff we want to get into today. We talked a little bit about an anniversary on Monday's show, a big Lakers anniversary, 19th anniversary of the three-peat team winning their third championship. We got another one that we want to talk about and link it to what's going on with the LeBron and AD Lakers today. Want to start into a little bit of a deep dive into the roster this year, who came through, who didn't, and talk a little bit about what the Lakers might want to do going forward to some of these roster choices that they're going to have to make. But I want to start, Andy, with a little bit of news. Melissa Rowland of Fox Sports is reporting that Jason Kidd is going to interview for the open Orlando Magic head coaching job. It was last week? The week before? Time still is meaningless to me, where Jason Kidd was named by Damian Lillard as potential replacement for Terry Stotts with the Blazers. Said no thank you, and now is still a hot name on the market. It appears, Andy, that there's at the very least a very good chance that Jason Kidd won't be back on Frank Vogel's staff next year.
Yeah, I mean, Jason Kidd has been a hot commodity as a coach for quite a while. I mean, he made the leap from player to coach without any type of experience. If memory serves, right after retirement.
It was the year after he retired, and then that didn't work, and then he ended up in Milwaukee.
Right. I mean, he's always been that guy in demand. He has tremendous respect around the league among players because of his playing career, with good reason. I mean, there's a lot that goes into Jason Kidd as a person that's going to be part of the discussion in this segment, but as a player, he's borderline untouchable in terms of his credentials, in terms of what he accomplished on the floor, Hall of Fame, championship, all of that stuff. And I think that buy-in that he will always have from players is something that organizations around the league will look at and say that papers over some of the other concerns, whether you're talking about character, whether you're talking about X's and O's, whether you're talking about how good of a coach is he actually. You know,
nobody totally knows.
But here's the thing, though. It doesn't matter how good your coach is. If he doesn't have buy-in, you are not likely going anywhere.
Yeah,
and Jason Kidd will have buy-in.
He will. And it's an interesting thing to look at because it is so hard to figure out who really is a great coach, particularly as a head coach, because your job as a head coach is very different than your job as an assistant. You know, to be honest, you're not as reliant necessarily on X's and O's. And you got a lot of guys, if you have a good staff, who can do that for you. That was never, it's a bit of a myth that Phil never drew up a play, but that wasn't Phil Jackson's primary value to the Lakers, was as a guy who could draw up a brilliant out of bounds play after a timeout. Kidd was name checked by Damian Lillard as somebody he wanted to be the next coach of the Blazers. He's got buy-in from LeBron James. Frank Vogel at his exit interview spoke in glowing terms of Kidd as a coach. It's not for me to say that he's not a good coach, but I will say all that other stuff that you're talking about is relevant. And I, as a person who covers the Lakers, and I think as a Lakers fan, I would be happy that Jason Kidd getting hired somewhere else removes the possibility of me as a fan having to play that sort of compartmentalizing game where you have to shove aside somebody's darker parts in order to root for the team. I'd be happy for that because the Lakers are in a place right now where they don't necessarily need Jason Kidd, who, if you remember, Andy, was basically brought on as Frank Vogel insurance.
The reason that he was not made head coach of this team is exactly what you were talking about with the optics. It was very clear that the Lakers were uncomfortable with the idea of hiring Jason Kidd with his past with spousal abuse, with a fairly recent DUI, all the different stuff that comes with Jason Kidd. He is, again, he's very well respected among NBA players and peers. He also has a reputation around the league that maybe has softened over time of being, frankly, kind of a prick. If we're really being honest,
and as a and from the coaching ranks as a backstabber. I mean, you know, I think the fact that he came through these 2 years as an assistant, and Vogel said, doing all the assistant coach stuff and whatever it is, not treated. Yeah,
by all accounts, it has been smooth with Jason Kidd with the Lakers. I have not heard a single report or whispering or anything about there being problems.
Right, but to be fair. We also never really had the opportunity to the conditions were never there to test whether or not Jason Kidd would do all the stuff that we were making jokes about when they hired him.
No, absolutely.
Quickly.
But it kind of
took all that off the table.
But you would hear though, I mean, especially with an organization that is both as gossipy and attracts gossip the way the Lakers do. If there was maneuvering behind the scenes with Kidd, that was rampant enough, we'd hear about it. I will say, though, in terms of the idea from a Laker fan's perspective, being happy that Kidd would be somewhere else so you don't have to deal with the baggage of him being a head coach. To me, I got to be honest, I understand what you're talking about. It's a cop-out. I mean, it's not like Jason Kidd's been on an internship. They've crossed that Rubicon already.
It is, but I think there is a difference though between a person being on staff and being the voice of a team. I disagree with you about that. I'll also say this:
you're either at peace with him being part of the organization, which the Lakers were, or you're not.
I get that, but I'll even but in terms of your cop-out comment and putting it on myself, I will also say I don't have a good answer to what the line should be, what the rule should be about somebody like, I mean, this is a thing it's documented in the case of Kidd. I mean, with the espousal abuse issues and stuff like this is it's not speculation. This is
absolute. We know these things have happened. I remember I wrote about this for The Athletic when we were writing for The Athletic more regularly, and also when Kidd was first brought in. And I wrote that I would not have brought in Jason Kidd. And to me, it wasn't just the transgressions. It was what appeared to be like limited remorse for all this stuff, or the fact that it wasn't isolated combined with all of the other stuff. But what I also pointed out, though, the absurdity of the way the Lakers went about basically trying to sneak Jason Kidd in through the back door, when in reality, he is higher profile than Frank Vogel. Like, he's somebody that you are, at least from the beginning, going to pay more attention to.
Yeah, there was that sort of element of no, just don't mind.
You can't hide your willingness to have him on your staff.
Correct.
To give him paychecks behind a title or the time spent before eventually promoting him. You are either at peace with this on some level, which, by the way, is not the same thing as condoning it, but it's on some level at peace with it, or you are not. Because these things are complicated,
right? That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't have a lot. Like, I'm sure there will be people listening to this is saying, "Okay, Brian, you don't want him on staff," or "Okay, Andy, you don't think he should be on." Well, does he deserve to never have a job again? No, not necessarily, but it doesn't mean I have to be the one that hires him. And I'll say this: like, these are incredibly complicated. Problems. And look, I mean, the Lakers will forever be tied to the legacy of Kobe Bryant. And Kobe has a moment in his history that is incredibly uncomfortable and awkward for people in Los Angeles to talk about. And it is nobody knows exactly what happened but it is, seems clear something did. And it is uncomfortable, and it is something that people don't want to.
By Kobe's own admission, his behavior in this situation, if not criminal, was unacceptable. This is from Kobe.
And I don't know what to do with a lot of these things, where a person should be excommunicated or where a person should be welcome back, or what is required, and all of those. I do not have good answers about that. And you're right, it is to some degree a cop-out to just be like, I'm glad somebody else has to worry about the from a fandom standpoint, worry about kind of investing in a team that has it. In the same way that many Dodger fans were upset at the Trevor Bauer signing. It's like, you you have to compartmentalize some, but you don't want to have to do it.
That's just life, man. We have to do this stuff in sports. We have to do it in entertainment. You often have to do it with your family. I mean, the life is messy,
and people are complex, and their histories are complex, and it is appropriate and it's due that we have these conversations, that we now have these conversations. That doesn't necessarily mean we're better at answering the questions that come up.
I will say really quickly before we move on that if Jason Kidd ends up hired by Orlando or hired by any other team that could have a vacancy, and like you said, Kidd's a hot name, I really hope the Lakers bring in somebody who is a proven offensive mind. Like you hear Terry Stotts' name tossed around, if not literally Terry Stotts, somebody like him, because the last few years under Frank Vogel, even with the defense being as great as it was, even with the championship, the offense needs goosing.
But to your point, they don't know, but they have a lot more flexibility now than they did then, because again, Kidd was hired as Vogel insurance. They don't need Vogel insurance anymore. Frank Vogel's, barring something weird, is going to be the coach for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. So you can get a guy who is an assistant coach, not somebody who's seen as like the next head coach, not a former head coach in waiting, whatever it is. You can get a guy who's one of these, well-respected career assistants to come and do that. And the Lakers have a lot more flexibility. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. That option is there. Next, let's take a look at the anniversary of the 2009 championship team, because there is some stuff with that team, the back-to-back group, that is relevant, I think, for the conversations that we have around the Lakers. We'll do that next. Want to tell you, though, that as we pointed out, this episode is brought to you by Michelob Ultra. This week's Michelob Ultra Player of the Week, Andy, Jordan Clarkson, former Laker.
One of the kids.
That's right. Shouting out to Jordan Clarkson. He's shooting over 50% in the conference semifinals against the Clippers through the first 3 games. And also, Andy, he paid to restore a Filipino food truck in Salt Lake City that had been vandalized with anti-Asian messages. Clarkson is himself Filipino, so this was certainly a personal gesture from him. So good work on all fronts from Jordan Clarkson, who, as we all know, plays with tremendous joy on the court. I am having a lot of fun watching him. This court's only worth it if you enjoy it. 2.6 carbs and 95 calories. Joy creates success. Enjoyment isn't the end game. It's the whole game.
That and getting buckets for Jordan.
Oh my God. Yeah. He really likes shooting the basketball.
Yes, he does.
So Andy, the Lakers 2009 anniversary of the 2009 championship team is Monday. Is that what it is?
Yeah, it was yesterday.
When you kind of think back to that team, what sticks out to you? Because we covered that group.
Yeah. The thing that always stays with me the most was just how intense that season was. Like that group had come off that disappointing finals, and there had been so much emotion leading up to that. Because remember, the entire offseason leading up to that year, Kobe had been demanding a trade. That was when he was going on the radio tour. That's when he was in the parking lot when the randos filmed him saying that Andrew Bynum's ass.
Right. You're talking about where they got to the finals and lost.
Right. Yeah. So there was so much. Yeah. There was so much leading up to that finals. And it felt like everything was really moving in the Lakers' direction. The Lakers had been favored in that finals. I'm pretty sure you and I both predicted the Lakers would win. And they didn't just lose. They got their asses handed to them in game 6. They lost by 39 points. I was in Boston when that happened. I've never seen a locker room like that afterwards, like where it was, the loss was so devastating and so emasculating and so just destructive. You didn't even know what to ask guys.
Particularly in terms of for reputationally to somebody like Pau Gasol.
Yes, for Lamar Odom, for Kobe in some ways, like for everybody involved. And that year, I remember you and I used to talk about it all the time. Like, my God, this locker room is edgy, man. Like, people were cooperative. Like, nobody were jerks to us.
No, there was no joy. I mean, you go back and you look at last year's title team. That was a fun team to be around. It was, again, very serious, very workmanlike, very businesslike, a hard hat group, as they say, Andy. But they also had fun. It was a group that clearly enjoyed the process, being around each other, all that stuff.
LeBron was always playing DJ, or JaVale was always playing DJ.
And, obviously the COVID changed things and the bubble tested some, but that was the nature of that group. That 2008, 2019 was no fun. No. And what I always try to figure out, because, the DNA of these teams is always different. Different leaderships, different eras, different opponents, different rules, different everything. Where are the similarities? Like, I look at it, and you talk about that loss in 2008. That was a specific kind of loss. That led to a lot of questions. It's different than how the Lakers went out this year, but I don't think I do think there are some parallels to those questions. The questioning of Anthony Davis again as a superstar who can really bring it, like who can stay healthy enough to do it, who can do all that stuff and show up when needed. It's gone from his play, which he proved last year, now to his health. LeBron, older. Less bulletproof than he used to be. I wonder if there will be some kind of similarity to the very palpable and intense motivation that we see when training camp opens next year, similar to what the 2008-2009 team had coming off of that Celtics final.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. And a reminder, today on the road to the finals, our NBA playoffs coverage brought to you by Michelob Ultra. It's only worth it if you enjoy it. And at 2.6 carbs, 95 calories, we can all enjoy the games a little more this season.
I mean, you know what I'm getting at? It's not the same thing.
I was going to say.
That was a pretty, but again, they got bounced in the first round as defending champions in a series that wasn't that close. There were extenuating circumstances, but it wasn't that close.
Here's the difference, though. Mm-hmm. The extenuating circumstances with this year getting bounced in the first round were really extreme. Yeah. I mean, you talk about the shortest offseason in NBA history. I think it actually may be the shortest offseason in like Big Four sports history. So you're talking about that type of scenario where you have to re-enter the season, and this being a real grind of a season for all the teams. Just some of them had an easier time dealing with it than others, just because they didn't have to deal with as quick a turnaround as the Lakers. And the circumstances being so extreme once the playoff rolled around, with AD being in and out of the lineup, LeBron clearly not being himself, guys like KCP getting hurt, Alex Caruso getting hurt, and the fact that the Lakers have won a championship with this core. The group that went to the finals in 2008 and got killed, the only guys who had championships were Kobe and Fish. So most of that group still had something to prove that I don't think these guys necessarily do. Like, you don't want to make excuses, but in this particular case, there are legitimate explanations that go into explaining why things ended as quickly as they did. And as I guess maybe you'd want to say as one-sided as it did. They're never going to fall back entirely on that. But at the same time, you're not talking out of your ass by saying, look, if Anthony Davis and LeBron are themselves, this series is at minimum against
the
Phoenix.
The Lakers would, I don't care. I know Phoenix is they just swept, a shorthanded, but still good Denver team.
They're really good.
And they didn't, it wasn't like 4 tight games. They beat the crap out of them. And so I think they are playing better now than they were at the beginning of the playoffs against the Lakers. But I still think that if AD was healthy, they're up 2-1. They very well could have come back in game 4 and gone up 3-1. I think they win the series. What fascinates me about AD, because let's be honest, in the same way that when you talk about the Lakers back then, almost every question seemed to be kind of a backdoor way of talking about whether or not Powell can hack it.
Or Lamar, but more Powell, because he was the 2, and Lamar was the 3. And the two of them got bullied around so much.
Absolutely. I just said there was a certain, I think, degree of eccentricity and inconsistency that was sort of baked into Lamar Odom at that point. But I think with AD, it's going to be really fascinating next year to see what he comes in as in terms of a regular season guy. When you look back on it this year, I think we all, especially as somebody who drafted him in the first round of his fantasy draft, I care.
How'd you end up doing, by the way?
3rd. I finished 3rd.
Okay.
I'm not allowed to talk about based on who is in the league, whether or not I won money, but
okay.
So, if AD, he came in this year and he was reasons to expect him. Does he come in next year, as Jared Dudley kind of suggested, as the man, both as a leader, but also as a bringing it every night player, coming in off of an offseason where he's heard a lot of talk and, is in a place where he had a full offseason to get healthy and has something to prove. I am fascinated to see what next year looks like for him, because good God, 75 games of him playing as he did in the finals would be staggering fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it will be really interesting to see if he actually is capable of doing that.
Yeah.
With the type of, I think both of us underestimated the effect that offseason would have on him.
Absolutely.
In part because of the quick turnaround, but also, and I'll admit this is the specific reason that I had forgotten about this, is Anthony Davis had never been on that long of a playoff run in his whole career. I mean, he'd only been in the playoffs with the Pelicans a couple times, and he'd gone a couple rounds. One of them,
the one time they upset Portland. That was the big sort of playoff coming out party for AD. But generally, they were Pelicans, not Pelicans.
So by and large, like he had never had to go through this again. I think it's one of the reasons why, counter to what we expected, LeBron was able to, until that thing with Solomon Hill, he was really able to come out of the gates really strong.
But he's also too. LeBron. AD is much more like every other player in the league.
Right.
Meaning he gets hurt. That's the norm. He gets hurt a little more than other people do, and he always looks like he's about to get hurt way more than everybody in the league. But we talked about, we spent some of Monday's show talking about how Lonzo Ball hasn't played 75 games or even 70 games in his entire career. And, and he's 25 years old or whatever it is. So this happens. So, I mean, this is something we'll obviously be watching over the course of the offseason. The Lakers do need to remake their roster in a lot of ways. One of the big differences in last year's roster versus this year's was the mileage they got out of the back end of it. We're going to take a kind of a deep dive into different players across the roster, starting today with some of those back end guys, and we'll do it next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline, the fastest, easiest way to bet on all your sports action. Baseball season's in full swing. You can track all the action at BetOnline. This week, as always, tons of sports action on the go. Get all the latest news, odds, info for your sporting needs, including MLB, NBA, NHL, UFC, MMA. I'm starting to actually look at the MLB standings again.
Once June rolls around, then you start looking. You don't look until June.
There's some teams like, wow, they're still in the league. Good for them. Before the next pitch, head over to BetOnline on your laptop.
There's a Minnesota Twins? Good for them. Plucky little state.
I didn't even know there was a Minnesota. Check out all the great sporting news, sign-up bonuses, contest information. That is true. That's not a believable joke from me. Everybody knows my worship of all things Prince. But whatever. Don't sit on the sidelines anymore. This is your chance to get in.
Arkansas.
That's true.
That's an eminently missable state.
Yeah, I was one Wyoming away from a punchline that just paid off. As your teams are neck deep in the playoffs, head to the website, use your mobile device, sign up today, receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Promo code Locked On. Bet Online, your online sportsbook experts.
Rock Auto, also a sponsor of the Locked On Lakers podcast. Some people are car guys. Some people are like me. They're not car guys. You still want to be able to do stuff on your car that may not be super complicated. You don't want to walk into a store and have some guy start, shaking your confidence, telling, oh, no, you don't want to buy that, or steering you to products, Andy, that may not be best for what you need, because that happens to be what he's got in his warehouse or the stuff that he wants to offload. Rock Auto, they're not going to do that for you. You got a computer in your pocket. It's called your cell phone. You might have a computer at your home. It's called a computer. You get on it and you log on to rockauto.com. Chain stores, they've got different price tiers for professional mechanics and do-it-yourselfers. Don't mess with that nonsense. Rock Auto's prices are the same for everyone, 20, 30, even 50% lower than chain stores or a new car dealership. So whether it's for your classic or your daily driver, get everything you need in a few easy clicks delivered right to your door. Go to rockauto.com now and see all the parts available for your car or truck, and write Locked In on their How Did You Hear About Us box, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, let's start this conversation about the roster with and I talked about it as Andy, kind of back end of the roster guys, but we have 3 different people here, all of whom kind of qualify in the end as back end roster people, but come at it from very different directions. Ben McLemore, Jared Dudley, and Markieff Morris. Keefe, buyout candidate last year. They brought him in, didn't do much in the regular season, but was great in the playoffs. Ben McLemore, brought in as a buyout candidate this year, had a couple opportunities and certainly was fun to watch and make jokes about sometimes, but ultimately was not a consequential player. And Jared Dudley, who barely touched the floor this year after, and it was kind of brought back almost like as a, like a player emeritus? Like, I'm not totally sure like what his gig was, other than to kind of, he was so good from a chemistry standpoint. That
he's there. Udonis has
there. Yes. When you look at these guys collectively, 3 players who ultimately were not helpful for the Lakers winning a title, that took up 3 pretty valuable roster spots. How do you evaluate what they did, or really more what they didn't do?
Well, let's start with Keith, because I think of the 3, he was the one that was projected to be most important.
Absolutely.
And I remember when you and I were still hosting Land of Lakers, we did a podcast, and one of the topics was whether the Lakers should prioritize bringing back Keith or Dwight Howard if they could only bring back one. And I said Keith because of the versatility that he offered the team, and, you know, with Frank Vogel looking to play, as I called him, medium ball. And like you said, there's no doubt that he was a critical part of that success in the bubble and winning a championship. He played pretty well, and I think you actually agreed with me on this, and I was wrong.
I don't remember. What's the right answer? Was the right answer they should have brought back Dwight? Because if so, then I think that's what I said.
Well, here's the thing. I was wrong about this, and Dwight would have been more useful. But that's not even really the reason that I was wrong. The reason I was wrong is Keith ended up so much on the periphery. Like, other than a stretch in March when a lot of guys were out, and he actually played really well. He averaged 10 and 6, 47% from the field, almost 42% from behind the arc. He wasn't really that effective. He wasn't the same wheel greaser or little things player that he'd been in the bubble. His limitations started coming through. And what stood out to me most with Markieff, thinking about this, is just, it's a reminder that not everything can be replicated year to year.
Yes.
And sometimes if things feel like outliers or anomalies, it might be because they are.
And yeah,
and I think that was the case.
As I noted, he was wretched in the regular season, and he wasn't particularly good in the bubble, you know, prep games. He just was excellent in the playoffs. And I think when you start to break down the contrast here, he wasn't he was worse in the regular season this year, even compared to last year's pretty bad numbers in his limited play in the regular season. Where it really stands out, though, this year is the difference between his performance in the playoffs versus his performance in the regular season. And, you know, you go through it, and, you know, he shot 44% last year, or 45%, I should say, last year in the playoffs, 42% from 3-point range. This year it was 22% from the field and 25% from 3. You know, just every true shooting obviously goes down. All the efficiency, all that stuff went away completely. And when I think about it, I don't know what the alternative necessarily was. And it gets to Ben McLemore. It gets to Jared Dudley. The Lakers are in a spot, and this is the challenge, I think, for Vogel. They're in a really difficult spot in terms of filling out these roster positions, which we learned this year really are important. It matters who your 9th, 10th, 11th guy is, because while you're not playing them all the time, you do need to be able to get real minutes out of them when they play. And last year they did, whether it was Dudley shot like 44% from 3-point range last year.
Quinn Cook played well when he played. Troy Daniels played
pretty well when he played. Like, and it's like, you don't want to lean on Dudley. Shot 43% last year from 3. You're not leaning on him to be great when he plays. He averaged 1.5 points a game. I'm not trying to fluff him up here, but like, he was competent. You could put him in for 8 minutes a game, the 45 games that he played, and he would be competent. This year he didn't play, in part because he was hurt, but also because the effectiveness went down, the shooting went down. He shot 22% this year from 3. It's a big difference. You know, Ben McLemore proved himself when you played serious games where teams could really pay attention to him to not be particularly useful, which is why he was available. And this gets to the problem that they have. You talk about needing offense, which is true. They need more skilled players. They have very limited means to find it. And trying to do that in the Markieff Morris salary slot, because I don't think Keith will be back next year, is not going to be an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's tough.
Or Jared Dudley or Ben McLemore.
Right. I mean,
you only get to choose flawed players.
Yeah, I mean, these are all league minimum type guys. I mean, you can make the argument that you could do worse than Markieff Morris on a minimum. And to be fair to Markieff, or just present the entire story, he, by all accounts, was very good in the locker room. He was very good at saying,
it's not personal.
No. I just for people who may not know this, he was known for an ability to speak up at times when it was really important, and veteran presences like that matter. It's just a question of whether or not you could do better. Or like in the case of someone like Jared Dudley, who I said before, he's like their unit Udonis Haslem. And, this comes up with Haslem, like the idea of do the Heat, are they better served keeping him on staff versus making him just an assistant or something like that? And the argument for keeping him on the roster is there's a certain weight and Jared Dudley's talked about this, there's a certain weight that players carry when they are on the roster that even as the same guy on the staff, it just doesn't register the same.
You can carry, though, one of those guys.
Right.
Maybe you can carry two of those guys. But the Lakers had Kostas, who, was there to entice Giannis and didn't work. No, probably won't be back. K-Cock, who showed, looks like he could be a competent NBA player, but, wasn't somebody you could put out on the floor. They had McKinney, who did okay. But McKinney was much more like what you would expect out of sort of the end of the roster guy, kind of like Dudley was last year.
McKinney was also, when they brought him over, there were questions. I mean, really, the reason that he was kept, and whoever else it was, I don't remember who came over in that JaVale McGee trade, wasn't kept. He was waived, whoever it was. I mean, a lot of it just had to do with contracts and stuff like that.
Right. And something he fits into that, more like last year, where we don't want to play this guy a lot, but Troy Daniels or Quinn Cook, when you put him out on the floor, there were moments where oh, okay, that's pretty good. He gave us some good minutes. They need more of that guy, where they got nothing from Dudley. They got really not much from Markieff Morris in an important roster spot. That was a place where they expected somebody to play. And the buyout opportunity that they got from McLemore didn't work. Well, they had too much dead space on the roster, and I don't know exactly. Sort of my final comment on this is I don't know exactly how Rob Pelinka fixes that, because they've got more limited means this year than last. It might have to come through a trade. It might have to come, where the 22nd pick in the draft. I don't know what it is, but they have to find more usable depth next year than they had this year.
Well, I think one lesson that you can learn from McLemore specifically, beyond what you're talking about in terms of just finding players who better fill out the back end of the rotation, is McLemore was brought in to be a shooter. And at times he shot well. And we had some games where he went on crazy rolls and would start filling it up. But if he's not hitting shots, he brings quite literally nothing else to the table. He is a god-awful defender. The one time in the playoffs, he attempted a pump fake drive pass. Absolute disaster. But the other reminder about somebody like McLemore, beyond the limitations that come with a one-dimensional player, is there was only so much he could fix the shooting by himself. You need more shooters in order to make somebody like Ben McLemore with his shooting actually more dangerous.
Yeah, because you need somebody who is capable of starting. New York got mileage out of starting Reggie Bullock. He's as we've said, he's a grown-up version. He's Ben McLemore for grown-ups.
Right.
Is he a great starter? No, but he's competent enough that you can put him. So you always have shooting there.
I was going to say you need more grown-up Ben McLemores next to the actual immature Ben McLemore in order to get the best out of immature Ben McLemore.
I would say in lieu of. But anyway,
or the Ben McLemore type.
Yeah, it's a good way to start the looking at the roster, is kind of understanding the importance of these end of roster spots. Something we'll get into a lot as we continue breaking down the roster. I want to remind everybody that you can subscribe to Locked On Lakers on YouTube. and get a bunch of stuff, including some web-only extras from interviews that we'll be doing. We got one coming up in tomorrow's episode with the great Mo DeKeel, always a favorite of ours and a favorite of yours if you follow the NBA on Twitter.
Everybody loves Mo.
Everybody loves Mo. That is actually true. That is not
it is really
hyperbole.
true.
I don't know anybody who doesn't love Mo. And if you don't love Mo, it's probably you who's the problem. So, we'll definitely make sure we have some YouTube stuff that goes up off of that interview, as well as everything we do for the podcast. We've got some other things lined up, and so you'll definitely want to subscribe to that. Reminder, Locker Room, Fridays at noon Pacific. Talk to us about the Lakers or anything else, I guess, that's on your mind, and we will see everybody on Wednesday.